And welcome back to Analysis, where we continue our look at the latest immigration bill and on citizenship. The director of Reprieve, Clive Stafford-Smith, highlighted in an article last week that in 1958, the US Supreme Court was asked whether it was constitutional to deprive people of their citizenship, where doing so would leave them stateless. And the court's verdict was that statelessness was a form of punishment more primitive than torture, thereby, of course, prohibiting it. But even that hasn't stopped later US governments from depriving their citizens of citizenship through extrajudicial killings. And now the British government is pushing for the power to deprive British citizenship from whoever it wishes. We asked numerous Conservative MPs why they decided to back the bill, but most were unsure or even unaware of the bill's contents and said they'd simply voted with the government in loyal fashion. They and the Conservative Party's Central Office all declined to respond to our requests for statements. The charity HUGS, which stands for Helping Households Under Great Stress, did issue a statement on the issue of citizenship. It's a long one, but it's worth reading in full. HUGS welcomes the courageous stance taken by the House of Lords to reject Theresa May's efforts to introduce a law allowing the government to strip individuals of their citizenship, even if it were to leave them stateless. Almost 70 years ago, the US Supreme Court recognized the brutality of such measures when it ruled that statelessness was a form of punishment more primitive than torture. Yet the motion passed through the House of Commons with less than an hour of debate and with just 34 dissenting voices. The current test for whether the Home Secretary can deprive someone's citizenship is whether she believes their presence in the UK is not conducive to the public good. Under the new laws, she will be able to make someone stateless if she believes their presence is seriously prejudicial to the vital interests of the UK. Neither of those explicitly mention terrorism, and they're broad enough that they could be applied to all sorts of behaviour that the government deems undesirable. The practical effects of statelessness are severe. Obstacles include the denial of opportunities to establish a legal residence, to travel, to work in the formal economy, send children to school, access basic health services, purchase or even own property, vote, hold elected office, and most importantly, enjoy the protection of a country. It is effectively, to quote the great journalist Hannah Arendt, to remove the right to have rights. That's the end of that quote from HUGS. Well, joining us in this half are Lina Mohammed, a caseworker at the Islamic Human Rights Commission, and Margaret Gilmore, Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institution. Welcome, Lina and Margaret. Let me come to you, Margaret, in fact, first of all. Britain, as a UN member, accepts the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And one of the rights that declaration says is the right to have nationality. I mean, if you take away citizenship, you're taking away that right. So it's not a privilege that you have, it is a right.
I think that it's a privilege to have British citizenship, but I think with that privilege comes certain rights. I think we should be proud to be British, and I think that is a message that everybody should be putting out. I don't like the idea of somebody who has British citizenship undermining the British state when they are in that particular position. So I think, first of all, it's a privilege and we should be proud of it. Then I think that we should recognise the rights that come with it. I do not like the part of this bill that gives rights to the Home Secretary to make final decisions on citizenship. I think that the laws, which are written by Parliament, have to be put in practice by the courts. So I think the ultimate decision should definitely rest with the courts. I think we have to stick by the rights that the European Court of Human Rights, the European Act of Human Rights that we've signed up to gives everybody. And the final thing is, I don't see why such a decision needs to be made when we're only apparently talking about a very, very small number of cases. If somebody's done something wrong and it would merit stripping them of their citizenship, then surely they've got to be tried, they've got to go through a court of law, and then a judge will make a final decision. I think or actually would make a final decision and punish them and put them into jail. I think we need to maintain integrity and the integrity of our courts and the integrity of a democracy.
No, but as you say, if somebody has done something wrong, then they should be tried and if found guilty, then punished in some way. But what about the original point, that how can you have a right to nationality and not a passport? What is the thing that shows you have nationality if it's not a passport?
It has to be a passport. It has to be citizenship. And I'm not in favour of stripping people of their citizenship, and I'm certainly not in favour of a politician having the ultimate right to strip somebody of their citizenship without that going through a court of law.
Well, Saghir Hussain, I mean, one of the other rights that people are supposed to have is the right to know what they've been accused of, if they're accused of something by the courts, I mean, or by the prosecutors or the government. What is the right that you have if they say we're taking away your citizenship?
Yeah, and I think that was one of the fundamental rights we had enjoyed for many years until a few years ago when the control orders came in and other pieces of legislation came in where people were able to be punished without going through criminal trial. So they would have their liberties deprived of them going through a civil cases. So I think that the difference there is between a civil and a criminal trial is that the burden of proof required, the burden of the evidence required is far, far less in a civil case than in a criminal case. And I think the point Margaret is making is quite important, is that the integrity of our rule of law, of our justice system, is severely being tested here by the kind of procedures that are being put in place here. So therefore, what's when you're talking about somebody seriously prejudicial to the interests of the United States, United Kingdom, what you're looking at is that Home Secretary, an elective official who is making a decision, has serious consequences based on secret evidence. That evidence cannot be tested properly by the legal team of the person who's subject to that order. Now, I got to mention how that evidence is gathered. That evidence is gathered by, for example, the interviews you have at Schedule 7 at the airports, other kind of meetings where the security services will stop you, or somebody from MI5 will call you for a meeting, or where you're doing something else, suddenly somebody, a plainclothes person, will turn up unannounced without any legal sort of representation, start asking you questions. And that is the kind of evidence that ends up finally at with the Home Secretary. Now, that's fine. The Home Secretary is entitled to gather evidence wherever they can, as long as it's lawfully and done properly. But nevertheless, the due process point, the rule of law point that Margaret is making is that the defendant or the person who's accused, him and his legal team must be allowed to test that evidence and put their point of view across. And what we're seeing now is that opportunity is being taken away by the so-called secret evidence of the secret court procedure that is so entrenched in British legal system now.
Well, Lina Mohammed, I mean, do you think that this is a sign of Islamophobia, or why is the government doing this, in your view?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we believe that this is a disproportionate response to threats to national security, but also that it disproportionately affects Muslims and non-white people, and really is an act of veiled racism. So, for example, of all the known cases of citizenship deprivation in the UK, they are all Muslims, with the exception of the Russian spy Anna Chapman. And of all these Muslims, all were non-white, with the exception of David Hicks. So we believe that it disproportionately does affect Muslims. But in addition to that, just going back to the point of citizenship being a privilege or a right, we absolutely believe that it's a right, because the alternative to citizenship is statelessness, where, as you rightly point out, one doesn't have any of the rights that a citizen would. And we believe that if a proposal like this went ahead, figures suggest that 3 to 4 million people will be instantly rendered as second-class citizens, because they won't necessarily have the same rights as those who were born with British passports. And we also know of those 3 to 4 million individuals who have been naturalised, that the majority of these people are non-white. So in every way you look at it, we do believe that it's Islamophobic and a racist proposal by the government.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, do you see any? Do you share that concern that Lena Mohammed has just expressed?
I think that the initial reasons for them even thinking about doing this thing, and I'd be surprised if it happens in the end, but I think the initial reasons are to do with security. But you can't wipe away the inevitable, which is the type of security they're looking at is very extreme. It's linked to the Al-Qaeda type of terrorism, and unfortunately it is a type of terrorism and the type of terrorist who may hide within the Muslim community. And that is very unfortunate, and I can see how that interpretation would be put on it. There's nothing you can do to hide that. I don't think Theresa May is racist for 1 minute, and I don't think the other people around her are, but I'm not surprised that she's going to find that she is going to be accused along these lines. But I do think this is to do with security. I don't think she's going about it in the right way. I think it's giving her a lot of trouble for a very small number of cases, and she's going to have to look at it differently.
Well, Patrick, do you think it is security that's the motive behind it, or is it to get sort of votes through some kind of Islamophobic dog whistle politics?
I think politically the issue has become very fudged. We were told just then that Theresa May or the people around her are not racist. I couldn't possibly make a judgment on that, but this is the team that gave us the go-home vans.
Yes.
If a government administration office is judged by its actions, then perhaps they haven't earned the benefit of the doubt in that capacity. Now, in terms of security, again, it's very, very questionable indeed whether, if these people are as dangerous as Theresa May says they are, that the best thing to do is to leave them to it, not only without any protection, but without really any judicial due process. I recently interviewed a man who had his citizenship stripped. He was Pakistani origin. He now lives in fear of an attack by the Taliban and in fear of an attack by the Pakistani forces.
Which country is he living in?
He's living in Pakistan now, after having his citizenship revoked. He describes multiple visits back and forward to visit his family between between the UK and between Pakistan, and what he describes is nothing short at all of harassment. Every single step he took throughout the UK and through Pakistan for a number of years, every time he flew in, he was stopped, he was questioned. He was accused of knowing very bad individuals indeed, members of the Haqqani network or the Pakistani Taliban. He was intimidated by MI5. He was called impromptu and made to turn up at the Metropolitan Police various stations. He was interrogated, shown pictures of his wife in a sort of, well, nice wife you have here, it would be a shame if anything happened to her type way, which is deeply offensive in most societies actually. But especially his native Pashto. So, from a security perspective, if they believed he was so dangerous, if the security services really thought that he presented a threat to national security, why didn't they arrest him?
Yes.
Why didn't they charge him? Why, if they accuse him of being a member of the Haqqani network, a group which modus operandi is exclusively attacks in Pakistan and the tribal areas, not in Britain, they don't have the wherewithal or the gumption to do it. Why do they think Britain's safer by leaving him in the exact spot where he's accused of being able to carry out those crimes? It just doesn't seem to be an effective security remedy.
I think the crucial point, I'm going to repeat what Lena Mohammed says, is that when we go down the argument was a privilege or a right, we actually talk about immigration politics. And immigration politics, what this will mean is that 3 million people will suddenly be told it's a privilege for you. Right? And that's really, I think, the crux of this debate. And this is what we have to be very honest about. If we are going to roll back the years of the whole immigration debate and say, well, actually, we made a mistake, let's talk about that. Let's not try to pretend it's a security issue for kind of reasons you just pointed out. Really, it's contradictory.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, I mean, isn't there... There's no such thing as absolute 100% security. I mean, you have to take certain risks. Life is about balancing risks against advantages. And surely the government is over-emphasizing security in a ridiculous way and losing human rights and also losing the trust and support of these 3 million people who are only naturalized Britons. In fact, they're potentially creating a security threat by alienating so many people, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that obviously they can already revoke the citizenship of people who have who have a passport elsewhere. So they've obviously, in the case that our colleague there has just mentioned, they've taken the easy way out, which is to take away citizenship because they're not entirely happy, and they've said, well, he's got a Pakistani passport, so be it. But I do agree with you that I do think that the reasons why they're doing it is for security, but I don't think they're justified on security grounds. I think they're making a mistake. I think because so few people are involved, they should be very careful. I think there are wider issues. And they have to remember they're going to get court challenges because we in the UK have signed up to the various international human rights laws, and the courts will find, against the Home Secretary if she takes away the rights that people are entitled to.
But do you think she's motivated partly by the fact that it is a fact that many British people, mainly Muslim, have gone to fight in Syria on behalf of the opposition to Bashar al-Assad? And do you think it's because of that that they feel there's somehow a greater security threat that has to be dealt with?
I don't think so. I think it's a different security threat, but there was a big security threat, post 9/11, post the Iraq War. There were other security threats. Al-Qaeda was stronger and that type of thing. So I think, we've had strong security threats before, and they're still looking at ways of avoiding another 7/7, another Woolwich, that sort of thing. And I think all the time they're trying to find ways of dealing with that. I just think undermining a democracy and our democratic legacy is not the way to do it. But I do believe that the underlying reasons are for security. I think she's misjudged in this particular case. And just going back, I think that you can still see having a British passport as a privilege, even though it brings with it certain specific rights.
Well, Patrick Gailey, you follow Parliament very closely. Do you think when this bill, which the House of Lords has rejected, goes back to the House of Commons for the third reading, that the government will continue with it, or do you think they will now take the advice that they should drop it?
I think you need to look at it from two perspectives. One is the current coalition government. The immigration bill is important for them because there are various immigration provisions within their manifesto. They have pledged to cut overall net immigration or even get tabs on how that exists currently. The second point of view of looking at it is Theresa May as a minister and touted potentially as a former Conservative Party leader. This is a very important bill for her also. This will be her legacy. By the time it gets through all the various stages, we're not going to be far out from the 2015 election. So there is a lot of uncertainty within the Conservative Party, MPs that I've spoken to. They are torn between whether they think Theresa May will jeopardise the entire passage of this bill just for one essentially very minor, she's admitted itself it would be rarely used, these stateless powers, a very minor clause. It's interesting, following on from our conversation just now, this idea that, as Sagir here says, if were statelessness powers enacted, that citizenship would suddenly become a privilege, and that would create that sort of dual level of nationality. There is disquiet among Tory backbenchers because they know how that's going to look. There are a lot of sort of black and ethnic minority voters who probably don't really vote for the Tory party anyway. And you can imagine that political opposition to this bill, they're probably not going to take the, it may make people safer route or it may protect our national interests route. They're probably going to seize on this opportunity to basically slam the current coalition government and basically make the same sort of insinuations towards racism that I think a lot of people think of when they hear these statelessness issues.
Well, that said, I think the intellectual and the moral argument has been lost by the government. But nevertheless, unfortunately, we have to recognise that this is a democracy where the majority rules, and the immigrants or the non-white people are 3 to 4 million at the most. And as I said, they don't necessarily vote Conservative. And I think how UKIP are doing in opinion polls, and whether people like Boris Johnson or Michael Gove are threatening Theresa May for the leadership of the Conservative Party will be far more important than what the intellectual or moral arguments are.
But I mean, the people, the 3 or 4 million people, they're not going to vote for UKIP. So if they get alienated from the Tories, they're going to go to Lib Dems or Labour, aren't they?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, I don't speak for the 3 to 4 million people, but I just wonder whether how many will actually be aware, or whether a lot of them will have accepted the clouded argument, which is that this is just to do with extremism, just a few bad apples. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so I'm not sure whether most people are aware of the actual full detailed arguments. And if you go deeply into it, then you recognise, actually, as Lena said earlier, is that suddenly, with a stroke of a pen, our right has now become a privilege.
Well, Lena, let me come to that point. I mean, obviously, you can't speak for 3 or 4 million people either. Nobody can. But do you think that the government is risking creating a security threat in the sense that perhaps a handful of some of these people will feel alienated enough to take action against Britain if Britain treats them this way in the first place?
Well, I can't comment on that, but I do. I mean, going back to the 3 to 4 million, in terms of their voting, if, as I was saying earlier, that the majority of those 3 to 4 million are actually non-white, statistically they tend not to vote Conservative anyway. So in terms of the demographic they're appealing to, the Conservatives aren't really causing problems for themselves. And I will note, just going back to Sagir's point about control orders, this is just another example of how the government has circumvented judicial process. So with the example of control orders, the original proposal by the Labour government was for indefinite detention. They were able to, although that was defeated by the Lords, they were able to achieve much of the same aims as the indefinite detention by imposing control orders. So I am quite concerned that despite the resounding defeat within the Lords, there's a way that the government can circumvent this anyway and achieve what they want without much risk to their own electoral base.
Well, thank you for that final point. We've come to the end now of this episode of Analysis. So I'd like to thank my guests, Lena Mohammed, Margaret Gilmore, Sagir Hussain and Patrick Gailey, and of course you at home for watching. Please tune in again for future discussions, and don't forget you can keep up with the discussion by following us on Twitter at the address below, or by following Islam Channel Current Affairs on Facebook. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.